message I've entitled Untouchable, and it's taken from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. This story intrigues me, and so I thought I would camp out on this story with you this morning to allow us to maybe get a glimpse into this woman's life and to see how Jesus affected her and how he can affect us. And if you'll notice, the songs that we sang today had something to do with God's hand in our lives. Hold to God's unchanging hand. And others, he leadeth me, he holds my hand. The service has been designed around this idea of sometimes in our lives we feel untouchable, and yet we're not. And so I hope that you're encouraged by this morning's message taken from Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better, and in fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Immediately the bleeding stopped. She could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? His disciples said to him, look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, who touched me? But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. And in my mind's eye, church, to see her hand, you need to look down, like way down, like down low to the ground, down, because that's where she was living, low to the ground. Low on the priority list, low on the pecking order. She's low. She's really very low. And can you see it? Can you see her hand in this story? It's likely gnarled, thin, diseased, probably dirt under her nails, and probably stains on her skin. And if you look carefully among the knees and the feet of the crowd, they're scampering. They're running after Jesus because Jesus is walking in their midst. But she's not walking, she's crawling. People bump into her, but that doesn't stop this woman. Others are complaining. She doesn't care. The woman in this story is desperate, because blood won't stay in her body. Mark chapter 5, verse 25 says, a woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years of constant bleeding. 12 years of clinics, 12 years of treatments, prayer meetings, incantations, you name it, she has, at this point in time, tried it all. In fact, verse 26 says she had suffered a great deal from many doctors. I thought it was interesting that Mark would characterize it that way, because in that context, you almost smell, a sense of quackery, perhaps. But this is Mark's account. If you look in Luke's account, it says something slightly different. And remember, Luke is a doctor. So Mark says she had suffered a great deal from many doctors. doctors. Luke simply states in Luke chapter 8, verse 43, that the woman, quote, could find no cure. Apparently, the words suffering and the words many doctors probably didn't suit Luke's notion of the Hippocratic Oath, or maybe he was just trying to help his colleagues out by avoiding a potential malpractice lawsuit. According to Mark, however, doctors had done absolutely nothing to heal this woman's disease. But they had taken great pains to remove this woman's wallet because she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. Verse 26. So this woman has no health, she has no money, she has no family, and she's been deemed unclean according to the law of Moses, which was the law under which this woman was living. The law protected women from aggressive, insensitive men during those times of the month. But in this woman's case, the application of the law had left her not just untouched, but untouchable. She was ceremonially unclean. And the hand that you see in the crowd, the one that was reaching for Jesus' robe, she has spent 12 years with no one willing to touch it. And I'm thinking in the story that couldn't have always been the case. Really? I mean, surely a husband had once taken this hand in marriage, and the hand probably looked a lot different 12 years ago, 20 years ago. You know, it was clean, and it was soft-skinned, and it was perfumed. A husband probably once loved that hand. And a family, I'm thinking, probably once relied on that hand. You know, a hand to cook, and a hand to sew, a hand to wipe tears from cheeks and tuck blankets under chins. Are the hands of a mother ever still? Only if they're diseased. And maybe the husband tried to stay with her. Maybe he was taking her to the doctors and to the treatment centers. Or then again, maybe he just simply gave up, overwhelmed by her naps and her nausea and her anemia. So he just simply puts her out, gives her a change of clothes and a handful of change, and that's it. Adios. And then just simply closed the door. You see, church, the woman in this story, she has nothing. She has no money. She has no home. She has no health. She has dilapidated dreams, of course. And her faith is become completely deflated. She is unwelcome in the synagogue or in her church. She is unwanted by her community because she's unclean. And for 12 years, this woman has been suffering and been in this position. That's more than a decade. That's 12 years. Imagine yourself being in that condition. She has nothing, and the only thing she has, which is her precarious health, is getting worse. And I'm thinking, well, maybe that's what did it. Because verse 26 says, she had gotten worse. And maybe this particular morning, because of her anemia, maybe she could scarcely even stand up. Maybe she had splashed water on her face and was horrified by some skeletal image that she saw in maybe the pool's reflection. I mean, what you and I might see from like Auschwitz photos, that's what was reflected back to her, gaunt cheeks, tired and taut skin, and two really full-mooned eyes. And this woman is desperate for a miracle. And her desperation then gives birth to an idea. Because verse 27 says, she had heard about Jesus. You know, every society has a grapevine, even the society of sick people. And word had gotten out among the lepers and the left out that this Jesus of Nazareth could heal people. And Jesus was coming to her location. In fact, by invitation of the synagogue ruler, Jesus was coming to the sleepy little seaside town of Capernaum. Odd, I think, that you would find the ruler of a synagogue and the woman suffering from 12 years of a bleeding disorder in the same story. Because the juxtaposition is pretty remarkable, don't you think? The ruler of the synagogue, he's a powerful man. This woman that we've described as, nicely putting it, pitiful. He's in demand. He's a ruler. He's a leader. This woman is insignificant. He's high, elevated to this position of being the ruler of the synagogue in town, and she's low, crawling on her knees, suffering from a disease for which she cannot find a cure. But the synagogue ruler's daughter is dying. And interestingly, the synagogue ruler's daughter is 12 years old. The same number of years with which the woman in this story has been untouchable. And I think sometimes, church, tragedy has a way of leveling the social topography of our lives. So the woman and the synagogue leader find themselves on the same path, in the same village, and on the same page in the Bible. And as the crowd comes, she thinks in verse 28, if I can just touch his robe, I'll be healed. And I'm thinking then, at that point in time, at just this right moment in time for her, she kind of crab scurries through the crowd. The knees are bumping against her ribs. People are shouting at her like, get out of the way. What are you doing crawling around on your knees? But she doesn't care because she is not going to stop. 12 years on the streets, being completely abandoned by her family and community, 12 years of that has toughened her considerably. And she is not going to take no for an answer. And Jesus' robe is now in her sights. Ornaments of holiness are dangling from his robe. Typically, these robes are decorated with 4 tassels that dangle from this blue thread that's attached to the robe. And it was an indication that this person wearing this robe was a holy person, and maybe Jesus was wearing that robe. Because I don't know how she could identify Jesus' tunic from anybody else's when she's crawling around on the ground. How would she know? So maybe that's what she saw. Maybe that's what attracted her. But what we do know is she was persistent and she was not going to stop because she thought, if I can just touch his robe, I'll be healed. And so she extends her hand toward the tassel or the robe, her sick hand, this really tired hand, the hand that the husband no longer wants and the family no longer needs. She touches the robe of Jesus, and we know from verse 29, immediately the bleeding stopped. And she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition, as Mark describes it. You see, church, life rushes in because she had touched the hem of her Savior's garment. Pale cheeks are now turning pink. Shallow breasts now become more full for her. There are cracks in the Hoover Dam of her fragile health condition, and a river now just floods her soul. The woman feels power enter into her. And what does Jesus feel? He feels power exiting from him. Verse 30. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" Sometimes I wonder if Jesus even surprises Jesus. I mean, has Christ the divine, in this case, moved faster than Jesus the human? Who touched my robe? You see, church, you cannot steal a miracle from God. His disciples, at the question, are incredulous. They say in verses 31 and 32, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. The disciples are incredulous, but Jesus is intent on finding the person who is responsible for the exiting of this power. And at this point in time, you can imagine the woman is pretty frightened because she has now touched the robe of a Jewish leader, a healer, but she was ceremonially unclean, which could potentially make the person that she had touched unclean as well. And this is the same Jesus of Nazareth who had come to Capernaum for purposes of helping heal a 12-year-old girl, not her. But this woman is desperate for a miracle. She has nowhere else to go. She is penniless, she is broke, and she is otherwise helpless unless she touches Jesus. And Jesus knows it. And despite hundreds of people likely amassed around him, he stops and asks the impossible question, "Who touched me?" And I'm imagining at this point in time with the incredulous disciples saying, "What do you mean, who touched you? There's hundreds of people here." I'm wondering and I'm thinking that the woman who had touched Jesus is now feeling a little frightened, a little scared, a little timid, because let's face it, she who was once ceremonially unclean had touched the healer of healers. What has she done? How now has she wrecked her life? How could this disease so overtake her that she thought that she could touch the hem of a Savior and find healing? She sought help from a dozen others before she sought Jesus' help. In fact, Jesus, we gather from the story, is like her last resort. And I think she's thinking, well, now that I've reached out and I've been healed, but now the healer is asking who did this, she's thinking, what is the ruler of the synagogue thinking? He's upright. Remember? She was formerly untouchable. And here she is lunging at the town guest. No wonder she's afraid. But as we know from the story, she has reason to have courage. She's healed. It says in verse 33, the woman, knowing what had happened, knowing she was the one, stepped up in fear and trembling, knelt before him, and gave him the whole story. The whole story. Did you hear that, church? The whole story. How long do you think it had been since someone, anyone, put the gear of life in park, turn off the engine, and listen to this woman's story? No. But when this woman reaches out to Jesus, that's exactly what Jesus does. With the town bishop waiting in the wings, a young 12-year-old dying, and a crowd pressing in, and Jesus asking crazy questions like, "Who touched me?" He still makes time for this woman from the fringe. And using a term he gives to no one else, he says in verse 34, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." And then apparently Christ moves on. But not before acknowledging the results of the woman's faith. And we gather from the story that eventually she moves on too. She's healed, right? But not before acknowledging the object of her faith, Jesus. And maybe the Hebrew writer perhaps had this particular incident in mind when the Hebrew writer writes in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, "Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will happen, and it gives us assurance about things that we cannot see." But sometimes, church, we can't we? Sometimes you and I get stuck in life, and we just can't. We can't see. We can't move on. We can't because we've been there. Or maybe we are there. Or we've been her. Or we are her. Each of us, from time to time, feels dirty and desperate and drained and frankly untouchable. We know that illness had taken her strength. And the question I've been asking myself this week, and I will ask you, what's taken yours? Red ink in your business? Hard drink? Late nights in the wrong arms? Long days in the wrong job? Pregnant too soon? Pregnant too often? I mean, is her hand yours? If it is, then take heart. Your family may shun it. Society around you may avoid it. But Jesus, He wants to touch it. When your hand reaches through the masses of your life, the crowds and the noise and the impediments and the things that prevent you from having a relationship with Jesus, when in that split second, out of complete desperation, you reach out for Jesus because He is now your last resort, you know what? He knows it, and He loves it, and He wants to touch it. And here's why. You're not untouchable because yours is the hand that He made. And church, your hand is the one that He wants to hold. And so as you go about your day this coming week, some of us have feelings perhaps of feeling beat up and worn out and dirty. And we keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. And we cry out to God, why? When will I ever learn? What keeps driving me to make this really stupid decision? And it's that split second when you're handing him your hand through the mass of your pain and the mass of your sin. And he feels you reaching out to him, and he senses your touch. And church, he wants to hold that hand. You know, God so loved the world that he gave us Jesus, his only begotten Son, so that we might not perish, but have what? Everlasting life. And did you read John 3:17? That's just as important. The purpose of Jesus coming into the world was not to condemn the world, but through faith in him, save the world. If God would do that for us, do you not think that he cares about your problems? That he cares about a disease? That he cares about a business problem? That he cares about a relationship issue? That he cares about a marriage or a friendship? Or whatever the circumstances might be, we all come to Jesus in the crowd with all sorts of different problems. But he's quite capable of healing us from all of them because he loves us. So let this be an encouragement to you this week. In times where you're not feeling too worthy, during times when you're feeling not so good about yourself, just remember this woman who eventually reached out to Jesus because she had tried everything else and it wasn't working out so well for her. And she's broke. She's destitute. She's alone. Her health is failing. She's been taken advantage of. She has nowhere else to go. And finally she reaches out to Jesus because she thinks, well, maybe he can heal me. It was her last-ditch plan. This week, try reaching out to Jesus sooner rather than later. Because yours is the hand that he made, and yours is the hand that he wants to touch. So we're going to sing this next song. Elliot, thank you. Precious Lord, take my hand. And so we're going to sing this song to engage your thought about asking our precious Lord, which Richard says so often in his prayers, and I so appreciate that because he is precious. This song is asking you to kind of camp out on this idea like, precious Lord, here, take my hand. And while we sing that song, if you have any prayer requests that you want us to pause for a moment and pray about, you can hand them up now. We'll do that, and then we'll close our services. Let's stand and let's sing.